Yeah, thanks for having me, Sarah. This is great. And put in the chat any comments of can't hear me, can't see me well, something that we could do better. This is a little bit of a different setup for me than usual. And this is a little bit of a different talk than I really am accustomed to giving. We're going to talk a little bit about the creation and story behind tree care for birds. And so normally when I start this story, I start talking about myself. But really the story is a lot about Corey Bassett, who is a really amazing urban forester studying, getting her PhD in urban forestry right now. And she wrote a great paper. This is a peer-reviewed scientific publication on the story of tree care for birds. One of the things we want to do is we want to be this hub of information where people are sort of bringing that things to us, and we can sort of transfer them to other people and things like that. And we realized that there wasn't much research going on, and we would like to know more about some of the science behind some of the practices that we're offering. So we published a scientific paper to try to reach the scientific community. Now, I suspect most of the people here connected today are not scientists. So we devised another plan to try to reach other audiences. So we applied to go to Sweden at ISA and do this presentation. And we were very disappointed because we got rejected, so we did not go to Sweden. And we're kind of bummed to get, I think everyone who didn't go to Sweden got relegated to this virtual conference. And we're like, well, that's a bummer. We recorded a video, we posted it online, we did a little Q&A. And there were something like 1,000 views and several hundred likes or reactions and great questions and comments. And at least one of those people is here today. Sarah watched that video, and it was kind of amazing how it worked out, and may work out with this video of you reach a much broader audience. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to just connect with different people, let them know about the Tree Care for Birds story and some of the resources available, and try to build a little consensus, try to keep things moving forward. And so that's our goal here for today. I'll just pause real quick. Anyone, feel free to interrupt in the chat or question and answer, whatever. We're going to have a little time for question and answer at the end, so send those in and we'll let Sarah decide whether to interrupt me or not. And then anything else in terms of voice or whatever, we're doing okay, Sarah? I'm standing in front of the camera, things like that?
Here, yes.
So, like I said, I go a little bit back in time sometimes. I grew up in a very strange horticultural family. I was obviously an incredible artist. I actually have no idea what this is right here. But every picture I ever drew when I was a kid had a tree in it. And those trees always had birds and other kinds of wildlife around. So as I became a certified arborist, a consulting arborist, a business owner, all these things, I continue to maintain this vision of that trees are wildlife habitat, and that's sort of very important to me and how I am as an arborist, even though a lot of my arboriculture sort of follows very traditional tree risk assessment and things like that. And so I have a little bit of a scientific background. So a few years ago, there was a report that came out and made major news throughout the country of, that North America over the last 50 years has lost 3 billion birds, right? They did these sort of big studies trying to figure that out. And so I'm not a scientist, but I can sort of understand science. I talk to scientists, I read the science. And so we see some interesting things when we dive into these reports, that actually wetland species have improved over the last 50 years. And that grassland and certain types of forest species are really what have been hit the hardest in the last 50 years. There's lots of super interesting things like that in this report. But it doesn't tell us much about sort of arboriculture, urban forestry, or what's going on in urban settings that we might look to other scientific papers, like this one published a couple years ago by Dr. Wood's lab in Los Angeles. And I think many of us are familiar with the idea of low-income neighborhoods have less canopy coverage than high-income neighborhoods, and that's something that we're working on rectifying. But he also showed, this lab also showed, that there were more birds in those areas with more trees, that the same dynamics played out in the sort of bird world, and that I think is really interesting and leads us to think about how does urban forestry, how are our decisions that we're making as arborists interacting with this sort of urban wildlife that we have there. And so almost every city that I go to, you can look up the sort of urban forest management plan or different sort of aspects of what the city has. And they almost always highlight wildlife as one of the key benefits that the urban forest is bringing, something that they're trying to manage for. And in my eyes, I'm seeing more and more of it, but I'd like to really see cities and arborists in these cities doing more to try to protect and encourage more wildlife in these urban areas, thinking a little bit more deeply around just having it on a list of all the benefits that trees bring. So us as arborists, urban foresters, tree advocates, whatever it is that we sort of associate ourselves with, we're out there impacting the wildlife in our cities by planting trees, by removing trees, and potentially even removing trees that have active nests in them or something like that. And that's a big part of what we're going to focus on today. Because in California, about 8 or 9 years ago, whenever I first got involved with this, the Oakland Post Office in California hired a tree care company to prune some trees that had nesting herons. And some Audubon folks happened to be walking by and shut down the project, called the police. It was a really big deal. It made the news, got me involved in my local law. A few months later, almost exactly the same thing happened in Southern California. So I went down to the Wildlife Treatment Center where they cared for the herons in Southern California. And there was a sign next to the phone, and it had this big list of things. It said, advice for callers who are witnessing removal of nests with eggs and birds. It had this big list of things, and it said, take pictures and video with like 9 exclamation marks. And I was like, this is trying to get arborists in trouble. That's what's going to happen here. And that when we talked to arborists, they didn't really know much about the laws. They didn't know much about best practices. And so we set out to change that. That was sort of one of our missions, one of our thoughts early on. Similarly, something that brought several people to the table in trying to start tree care for birds, try to figure out some of these things, was that several cities in Southern California were considering total moratoriums on pruning, especially street trees and park trees, during the breeding season. So City of Poway, which is down near San Diego, basically passed a law saying no pruning of street trees from March 15th to June 15th for the bird mating season. And if this happened on sort of a wide scale, we could see a lot of big problems with that potentially in the tree care industry. So that brought a lot of people to the table. This was our very first meeting. We were just a group of people that were interested. There were agency folks and wildlife biologists and wildlife advocates and arborists and all sorts of different people. And we came up with sort of 4 ideas pretty early on. I've touched on these a little bit, which is that arborists generally want to act responsibly around wildlife, but really did not have information about how to do so. And that knowledge of the wildlife laws, such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, was relatively unknown in the industry and potentially being violated without knowing anything about it. That routine tree care had the ability to impact wildlife, in particular, violate these laws by impacting nesting wildlife because they're so stationary at that time. And that there was a lot of opportunity to do education, but that most of the education out there, such as don't prune during the breeding season, both at a wide enough scale had a lot of ability to impact the industry negatively and had the ability to not protect wildlife that breed outside of that time period, right? Because we just make up this breeding season. There's no actual biological breeding season that sort of is flexible between different species and things like that. So first thing we did was a scientific sort of literature review, and we found very little, not a lot to base things on. So Corey and I did a lot of what we call gray literature review, right? Where we're trying to find cities that have developed similar sort of plans. So here's one in Vancouver, here's one in Portland, Oregon. In the UK and other places, they're more focused on bats than we are. Here in at least the West Coast, I think in the Midwest and Hawaii and other places, bats are a much bigger, let's say, problem, but issue to deal with. And that many Audubon groups had documentation as to what to do, and most of these just said don't prune during the season and things like that. So we set out to write best management practices, and we decided at first to just focus on California. And we had a couple of different philosophies here. One was that you could go in a lot of different directions here, but our main focus was going to be routine tree care, not sort of design, not sort of restoration. How much ability did that have to impact wildlife, and how could we minimize that impact? And that there would be no shalls. So anybody who's read a lot of sort of industry documents, shall is very strong, should is less strong. And these were all just recommendations of what people could do if they wanted to be responsible. And then probably the biggest thing that happened to our organization over the years was we were adopted as a committee of the Western chapter. And so the Western chapter of the International Society of Arboriculture is California, Nevada, Arizona, and Hawaii. And so I'm now the chair of the committee of this sort of portion of the Western chapter. But I think it's probably pretty obvious, just thinking about this, that a document designed for California needed to be equally applicable in the mountains around Reno and in the deserts of Phoenix and in the tropical islands around the suburbs of Honolulu. This was kind of a feat. And in particular, some of the difficult parts were that in Hawaii, there were really two endangered species that the whole best management practices that the whole focus was on. This is the Manu Oku, and then the white tern, and we'll look at another one later. And that we had different laws. That California has its own state laws. Most states, I'd say, don't have many wildlife laws, rely on federal laws. But because we'd already written it for California, we had sort of California specific information there. And that the amount of professionals in different areas was widely variable, right? How many wildlife biologists are there in different areas? How many wildlife rehabilitation centers are there in different areas? Changes potential recommendations. And so what we eventually did was we decided to take all of the California information out of the main part of the document and put it in an appendix down here, and make really general best management practices. So this top box here should be broadly applicable to everyone in the United States, should work relatively well in Canada, should work relatively well lots of places. And then really some details about these individual states that we think are important as well. And so I'll just point out that the yellow bar here means that it's the whole Western chapter. This is the most recent version. I think April 2022 is the most recent version. I'm going to push out another one pretty soon. But you can go down to treecareforbirds.com, click resources, BMPs, and download a free copy. We're always going to have free PDFs available. That's something that we've always been interested in, as well as booklets for sale that are relatively cheap. So we'll do a quick pause here and check in, because we're about to dive into what it says in the best management practice a little bit and things like that. That's a little bit of the story of developing these. But are we ready to talk a little bit about laws? So there are three main laws in the United States related to wildlife that we think are important to know about. The first is the Eagle Act. Both the bald eagle shown here and the golden eagle, we only have two species of eagles here in the United States, have really high levels of protection. It's pretty obvious if you're near an eagle's nest, and we think that this happens, especially up here in the Pacific Northwest, but that this isn't the sort of biggest issue for people to be aware of. The biggest law, we're going to focus somewhere else. The Endangered Species Act protects species that are, threatened to go extinct and trying to keep them from going extinct, and can be really hard to follow when you have endangered species in your area. So the Hawaiian hoary bat right now is up for review. It's currently listed as endangered, but they're sort of investigating that and thinking about downgrading it. And you can see why, because it's so difficult to navigate these sorts of recommendations and be able to do tree care, because basically you cannot disturb, remove, or trim woody plants greater than 15 feet tall from June 1st to September 15th. It impacts a lot of projects. That's pretty hard to navigate. Similarly, in the Midwest, where they have Indiana bat and other endangered species there, they have policies that look a lot like this, depending on where your funding is coming from. Bat populations are going down all over the place. We should all be ready for more difficult bat regulations to come to our areas. Here in, I can't read this because it's too small, but here in Washington, I believe you have 46 endangered species. And when you look at the list, the ones that live in trees are maybe only 4 or 5. Of those, the ones that you're likely to run into on your average arborist job are essentially none. So I don't think the Endangered Species Act is where we would focus. What we would focus on is the Migratory Bird Treaty. And that's because the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, it doesn't matter whether birds migrate or not. All that matters is whether they're native to the United States. So there's almost 1,100 native birds in the United States. And the Migratory Bird Treaty Act protects almost all of the species that you see on a regular basis, including really common things like Canada goose or American robin, like ravens and crows or house finches. These are all protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. There is a list of 122 non-native birds that are not protected, specifically not protected. These you might see as well, such as the house sparrow, the European starling, or the rock dove or pigeon. Okay, so we've highlighted that we need to be able to identify species to some extent to be able to follow these laws. So what I normally do is we're going to do a little quiz here. And Sarah, people can go in online in the chat to try to answer. Normally people just shout out the answer. But I've never quite done it this way, and we can just skip over it if you'd rather, or we can give this a try. Okay, so we're going to gradually get more and more information, and I'm not sure you're going to be able to hear this first part because we're going to start with the sound. But here is the sound. And then this is where it lives. So it winters down in sort of Mexico and Central America and goes up north. And Sarah's going to shout out answers as they come in on the chat. It eats primarily insects and nests sort of up in trees. This is what the female looks like. And this is what the male looks like. Does anyone know what this is?
I'm waiting to see if anybody says.
Sarah, what is your guess?
Well, actually,
It is not a house finch. And I made these somewhat difficult. It is not a warbler. These are not, the most common, most known birds. But this one's pretty recognizable and is migrating through Washington right now.
It is a sparrow.
Not a sparrow.
Not
a finch is also.
I love it.
I think these are particularly common. All right, so we'll give you this one. We'll have another one later if we get to it. This is a Western tanager, and one of the more sort of vibrant, beautiful birds that come through during migration. Protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty. So if you read the act, it's really not very long. It was written over 100 years ago. It says that you can't kill or injure any migratory bird. Remember, it doesn't actually mean migratory, it just means native to the United States, or any part, nest, or egg. And we're really focused on this nesting portion here, right? Because they're so vulnerable at that stage. They're so stationary. Maybe don't try, but like think about trying to catch an adult bird. It's almost impossible. And so really, we think that most of the damage is happening to the eggs and young while they're in the nest, because that's so good. So the question is, we talked a little bit about federal laws. I don't think there are any particularly relevant state laws or local laws in Washington. There certainly might be. I'm not an expert here. But again, we wrote these best management practices with this main BMP. And then all of these appendices, all of which I would say I don't think are very applicable here in Washington. In British Columbia, I actually tell people that I think the California appendix is pretty good because British Columbia has its own wildlife laws that I think are relatively similar to the California law. There's certainly some differences. And so the question is, what else do we need in order to sort of give good advice for here in Washington? And one resource that we have that I showed earlier is this City of Portland document, because I think Portland and Tacoma aren't that far from one another, relatively similar, might have some good advice in their books. So in the best management practice, one of the first things it tells you to do is have contact information for a wildlife biologist and a wildlife rehabilitation center. I don't know wetlands wetlands and wildlife, but I find that most wildlife biologists in the Pacific Northwest are really aquatic focused and then do a little bit of avian terrestrial stuff. And so it'd be worth trying to find who you could rely on if you found yourself in a difficult situation where you needed a wildlife biologist, establishing that relationship, finding someone. I just do a quick web search of consulting ecologists, city, state, and look around to see what I can find. I just like showing that there are some available. I couldn't find like a slam dunk, this is the one who I would obviously find. And then same with wildlife rehabilitator. The state of Washington has this little drop-down list where you select your county and the wildlife rehabilitation center pops up. Having their contact information while you're in the field in case you have a big problem is something we definitely. Okay, next thing we recommend is knowing whether or not it's the breeding season. And you would think that this would be easy to look up, but I will tell you right now that I think there's a lot of debate as to what to use and what to consider the breeding season. The Farm Bureau puts out this map, I believe, which seems like a very strange organization to be putting out a breeding season map. And we'll highlight that April 1st to July 1st is what they list for Washington. That doesn't seem like the worst answer, the worst thing to use. But anyways, we'll just point out that we don't have a really solid answer to this, because the other thing I find is, nesting birds on Washington coast razor clam digging, right? It's hard to find information, but they say April 1st to September 15th. But that's way out on the coast in this sort of very different than a treed environment. And again, I really like what City of Portland has done here, because they show all the variation in the species and their sort of nesting seasons, right? So if you look at great horned owl is a classic early nester, right? It's nesting out here in January and February, whereas something like a lazuli bunting is just arriving in town and going to be, starting to nest in sort of May and June because it's not in Portland until then. And that when you add all of these together, you can sort of get an idea of what the breeding nesting season is in your area. And they break it up into August 1st to January 31st as the non-breeding season. They have this early and primary breeding season. I'm not quite sure what to do with this exactly. Should you use February 1st to July 31st? You just use April 15th. Anyways, we would have to figure that out if we wanted. For those of you who are out there trying to act responsibly, there's still quite a few decisions. Okay, and so then what City of Portland and lots of other plans like this essentially say, hey, try to do all your work in the non-breeding season and try not to do any during the breeding season. That seems like good enough advice, but is very, very difficult to follow from this. And so we decided to make things more complicated, because that's always the solution to like, this isn't working for us, so we need to try to add another element to it. And what we've done is we've added habitat value. We've decided that we think that working in these low habitat value areas during the breeding season is probably better than just this blanket approach, where we think arborists are out there working in a lot of low habitat value areas. And so not only is there less likelihood that there's going to be nests in these trees, there are these tiny little trees. You can go find that nest pretty easily. You maybe don't need a wildlife biologist. You could just go and look around in these trees. And so that's what we're sort of thinking. Whereas in a high value habitat area, hey, maybe we leave that for the non-breeding season. And then in our sensitive habitats, in a lot of projects, you already have wildlife biologists included in these areas. I'm not sure arborists are working a lot in these sort of sensitive habitat areas. And you combine them together where we have our breeding season and our habitat value to come up with these categories. And these categories relate to an appropriate level of training. And we just sort of made a lot of this up. We think that it makes sort of logical sense. But the idea here is that you all today are getting some good awareness training. And so working in the non-breeding season in a low habitat value area, great, go for it. And then if you want to work in these sort of category 2, breeding season in the low habitat value area or non-breeding season, maybe you should get a little more training. And if you want to work in these sensitive areas and whatever, maybe you should have a wildlife biologist on call. Maybe you should on your project should involve a wildlife. Now, for the wildlife trained arborist, again, we just made this term up. This doesn't exist anywhere, but I check all of those boxes in the workshops that I run. We do several wildlife workshops. These are like 6 to 8 hour workshops, depending on how it goes. There's a few other people that run them as well. So here we are in 2002 in Tacoma, Washington. I can guarantee you there are some arborists here in Tacoma with this level of training, as well as Spokane, Victoria, Hillsborough, Coloma, Los Angeles, and Prescott. So we've been doing quite a few of these workshops. We have a few planned this year. The PNW's annual conference is in Tacoma this year, this fall. And so we may run a workshop here in Tacoma, is that, September, October. But I'm definitely doing 2 in California, 1 in Boise, and 1 in British Columbia. These are all through the Western chapter and PNW ISA. But if anyone else ever wants to run their own workshops, we're totally open to that, figuring it out. We like trying to get some of this information out. Once you've figured out if you have enough training for your job, the idea is to go out and do a pre-work inspection every job all the time, right? And depending on whether it's breeding season, depending on your habitat value, you may do a really in-depth inspection, you may do a pretty quick inspection, but we're looking for all sorts of signs of nesting wildlife. In particular, we're looking for these active nests that have eggs in them. Everything else is just trying to lead us to those active nests. And if we do find any active nests, we suggest setting up what are called sort of no-work buffers. These generally tend to be pretty big, but a lot of time we're just sort of going to say, hey, we're not going to work here for a couple of weeks until the young leave. And then most of the time we can go ahead and work again. Eagles' nests and other endangered species nests might be protected, whether they have young in them or not. But most other species, once the young leave, that nest is sort of no longer. Wildlife emergencies is something to definitely be prepared for, as I said before, mostly with contact information for your wildlife rehabilitators. This is like, young have fallen out of a tree. This is like, I really did an inspection, but I didn't notice a nest and found it on the ground and have to do something about it now. This is like a tree failed and had a nest in it. This is not, hey, this project really needs to happen, so I'm going to scoop the wildlife out of their nest and bring them into a rehab center. That is a violation of law. This is responding to a real emergency. So for example, this is my wife's hand here. As I said before, if you can catch a bird in your hand, something is wrong. And so this one was sort of stuck in this little alcove area in this cabin that we have. So she managed to grab it and sort of release it a little while later after it had recovered. Sometimes I hear that, hey, this is too much, Ryan. We can't do this as arborists. This is really outside of our scope, outside of whatever. And I just want to point out that our industry documents say that all arborists should know about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Endangered Species Act if we're going to be doing tree care in the United States. So pruning best management practices says that arborists should be aware of their national and local wildlife regulations. And prior to beginning any pruning operation, inspection should include, and there's a big long list, and signs of wildlife nesting is one of those points. But this is sort of all the guidance it gives you. And so we're hoping that our best management practice can sort of take things from there and give you some real guidance about how to do some of these things that it says you should be doing in our industry documents. And so thinking about expanding this to other areas, how would you use this in Washington? What would happen next? There's a whole variety of options, and that's what we as Tree Care for Birds want to be available to you all as a resource for. We would love for some momentum to write more appendices for more states or for different chapters. The Pacific Northwest ISA chapter right now has much bigger fish to fry. It's safe to say we will not be, working as a chapter to do this anytime soon. But any organization could do this. Any company could decide how they wanted to sort of run this and write their own policy. And we're just here to help anyone do that. So we're going to pause here for a second because I'm about to change gears in saying one of the ways in which I think a Oregon and Washington appendix might be different from the others is in sort of the augmenting wildlife habitat, in particular around snags, that there's much more appetite, much more culture of leaving, retaining, managing snags over time. That I think if we were to write something up here in the Pacific Northwest, I would like that to be better emphasized. And we'll get into that a little bit here in a second. But like I said, we're changing from this minimizing impacts from routine tree care to this sort of, thing that foresters have been doing for a long time. A few arborists have been playing with, and more recently, we're seeing a lot of arborists getting involved with snags. What do you all think of snags? You see many around Tacoma, you like them? Being an arborist in California and now in Portland, the amount of snags and knowledge and comfortability and wanting them is so different. And so it's something that maybe we take for granted here in the Pacific Northwest, and that other places in the country don't have that same amount. And they could benefit a lot from our knowledge, I think, in trying to share that one. I try to make some disclaimers here, and so let me make one here. Someone is going to hear me say, hey, we should be preserving every dead tree in every situation. Brian said it's safe. I am not saying that. We should be removing a whole bunch of trees as they die. And in very specific situations where arborists are involved and doing good assessments and things like that, we definitely can be retaining more dead and dying trees, and the wildlife would be happy. Do we have any questions yet? Are we ready to forge ahead? As arborists, as an arborist, I was trained to approach this tree and notice certain things about it in certain ways. And almost all of them are negative, right? There's this poorly attached epicormic regrowth after a heading cut. It just rolls off the tongue, right? Just an easy little phrase to say. We've got dead branches, codominant branching. We've got cavities with decay. I'm thinking, I'm scared. This tree is in trouble. It's time to remove it, something like that, right? The problem is, if a bird approaches this tree, it might notice similar things. It might actually notice the exact same things. But think about them as dense hiding or nesting areas, as potential nesting cavities, as perches, and for good areas to hunt for insects or to excavate out a cavity. And so a lot of the times, the same things that we're trained to remove are the exact same things that the wildlife really want more of in our urban forests. And that a lot of what I'm going to talk about isn't so much that these things are like way better than a healthy living tree. It's that we remove all of them. So there's a underabundance of them in our urban areas. So we did a risk assessment of this tree, and we decided that the risk of this branch failure and hitting either the house or a person was higher than the risk tolerance of the property owner. We might recommend some mitigation to that, right? And that typically we would think about two pruning options in sort of a traditional sense, where we would either do a reduction cut up here, where we would try to remove some of this end weight and have retain as much of the branch as possible. I think that this probably isn't the right option because it probably doesn't remove enough weight to adequately mitigate the risk that we have here. And then we would have a removal cut. So we basically are stuck with recommending a removal cut. And again, this is assuming we're keeping this tree at all. Probably most people are recommending removing this tree anyways. But let's say our homeowners say, oh, is there any way that I can keep part of that branch? There are bluebirds that come and nest in this cavity every year, and it's the best part of living in this house. And I think a lot of arborists would say no, but that to me, the correct cut, the correct pruning option for this tree is a heading cut. And so often we're told, don't top trees, don't make heading cuts, things like that. And that's all true until we get to sort of later life stages of trees, until we start managing it for sort of different goals than tree health. This tree is not healthy. No management trying to increase its health is going to do any good. The only thing that we're doing here is managing its decline, and that this heading cut is unlikely to do anything negative to this tree. All that it's done is mitigated our risk and kept our important wildlife. And not everyone wants this tree in their yard, but some people do. And not everyone wants this tree in their yard either, but some people do, right? So we would continue monitoring, we'd come back over time, and we'd remove a little bit more of the tree. And in particular, I think not everyone wants this snag in their backyard. But I can tell you from my experience in Portland, some people do, and I'm sure that's true here in Tacoma and really lots of places. And so I think that you'll hear arborists and other people say, this is inappropriate, this is, we can't make heading cuts, we can't whatever. And that I'm going to say that that's not true, that in our ANSI A300 standards, we have new objectives the last time that it came out for managing wildlife habitat. So we have a totally new objective in which we're not thinking about tree health, we're not doing all these other things, we're managing strictly for wildlife habitat. And that allows us a little more flexibility to do some different things like making heading cuts. There's a heading cut exemption. There's a big list of things why you might consider making a heading cut. And conserving or creating wildlife habitat is on that list. And that I can't think of any example better than the one I just showed you with potentially some bluebirds nesting in it. Now, we weren't going to make that cut during breeding season while they were actually nesting in there, right? Because that would potentially disturb them. We're hopefully doing that sometime when they don't have eggs or young in that. The tree risk assessment BMP actually has really interesting insight into how to do some of this. So it says in some low use locations, dead and decaying trees may be retained for wildlife, habitat, or other uses. And then it gets into that selection of these both depends on wildlife, the wildlife habitat benefits and on the risk and sort of trying to find the right balance between those for your individual situations. So one really great thing about living in Portland is the backyard habitat certification program. And these are old data. This is from almost a year ago, I think. They had almost 9,000 properties enrolled and covering 2,100 acres. I know they're up to 10,000 now. And that basically you get certified at a couple of different levels and you can earn points in a few different ways. And one of them is by having snags and nurse logs on your property. And so back then, a year ago, I asked them how many properties received points for this. And they said 1,200 properties, right? So a lot of people are asking arborists for snags in their backyard because of this program. And so there's so many opportunities to find ways to preserve snags. And not every tree should be preserved or turned into a snag. But there are so many healthy, strong trees growing into power lines where we could convert these into a snag. And if we can't tolerate the risk, if we can't find a way to convert this into a snag, we could leave it as a log. And that was another way to earn points in the backyard habitat program. So of all the things that arborists could be doing out there to increase the wildlife habitat in urban areas, downwoody debris has got to be the easiest. Okay, so we showed that snag earlier that had this sort of flat top on it, right? And so that's level one. And so we're going to show some of the sort of more advanced techniques that arborists are doing in urban areas. And a lot of this, none of this is new. This is stuff that people have been doing in arboriculture and in traditional forestry for a long time. But so we went from the flat tops to what Brian French, who does a lot of this work in Portland, calls the Bart Simpson haircut here, where you're getting a little bit of structure. But if you're looking at natural areas, a lot of what we're trying to do is mimic nature. When these trees snap off, it's really jagged up there. And so in our workshops, one of the main things we focus on is how to physically create those. How do you hold the chains? What do you do in order to create these coronet cuts or these sort of jagged tops on front? So here is Scott Baker demonstrating, again, here in Tacoma, Washington last year, how he does it. And then this is one that Brian French made in our workshop in Spokane. And so these are some ladies from the Spokane Audubon Society who were so excited about this idea and going to try to ask arborists to do this on properties around in Spokane that they knew people wanted more wildlife. This is probably a lot aesthetic rather than sort of functional, but it certainly is getting fungi in there. It is doing a whole variety of things, but I do think that it's much more attractive. If I'm looking at these, I pretty clearly want my snag to look like this, if at all possible. And so that's, here in the Pacific Northwest, we spend a lot of time in our workshops focusing on chainsaw angles and how to actually do that. So here's a couple of snags that we have in the Portland area. I believe this one on the left, Brian French took this photo of a snag he created on private property. I took this photo in a park, in sort of this natural area within a relatively typical sort of turf park. In Portland, we got a couple of raptors enjoying them as well. At the end of the day, we're not going to judge the success of these snags. The wildlife are going to judge the success of the snags. So if you want to learn more about this, come check out one of the workshops, reach out to us. We've got more information. There's other advanced things that people are doing that we can offer as arborists, such as rather than using nest boxes, creating these cavities, creating these nest boxes within our snags. And you wouldn't want a lot of weight above this. You want to think this all the way through. One thing that's really important about this is each species is very specific about what it needs. And so here are, if you go to All About Birdhouses, it's got all the specifications to build birdhouses. And this is a little bit sort of backwards and reverse engineered, but you can just use these specifications in trying to carve out these cavities. And yeah, a lot of people are doing this with a lot of success. Again, this is something that the Forest Service developed. Probably the red-cockaded woodpecker would have gone extinct in the Southeast if the Forest Service didn't develop some of this stuff. I'm sure they just learned it from someone else. I doubt they invented it back then either. But as I pointed out earlier, you have to know your species in order to know what dimensions and how high and what angle and whatever else to put these at. So we have a cavity nesting species here as our second quiz. So you're going to monitor the chat. If either of you know it, you're going to shout it out. I've got prizes over here. We can mail it. You can decide if you want to mail it to someone in the chat, whatever. But here's what it sounds like. I'm not sure anyone can hear that online. So we'll just go into the next one where, again, this is a migratory bird that breeds here in the sort of Oregon, Washington area, all the way up to Alaska, and overwinters way down south in Central America. It's a cavity nester and eats primarily insects. And this is the female poking its little head out of a cavity in a tree. Any guesses yet? I'm going to slow down just for a second, take a drink of water. Anyone recognize that sound? All right, this is the male. This is a swallow. Do we know what species of swallow this is? Beautiful. So tree swallows and violet green swallows are a little hard to tell apart, but you can really see the violet and the green on the back of this swallow. And so, but generally, if you're trying to tell them apart, what's easiest to look for is the eyes in the white, and the rump has this little white part back there. That white rump going around the back is what I'm looking for. And that's what I have for today. Happy to answer some questions. For getting swallow coordinate, I have a variety of potential prizes here. We've got forestry for the birds for Western Oregon. I just went to this workshop. It was amazing. We've got best management practices for wildlife, Western chapter. We've got some little tiny placards for a tree, in particular a snag, saying, hey, we're preserving the snag intentionally. I didn't mention that. Corey, Brian, and I literally have an hour-and-a-half discussion posted to the PNW ISA's website that you can pay for and watch as a webinar, where we talk for an hour-and-a-half about wildlife habitat snag signs, just the signage. crazy. And then, like I said, I'm also author of the Trees and Construction Best Management Practices. Which of these do you want?
I'm gonna do the snag tags.
Yes.
That would be-
Done.
Thank you.
All right, so that's what I have for now. Any questions from you all here or in the chat? Yeah, so the question is, what hard evidence do we have that these snags are good and working? Almost none. I'm not aware of anyone actively monitoring them. I'm not aware of anyone doing any sort of scientific research about it. One of the reasons we wrote that article, and this whole talk is sort of built around that article, try to get some scientists to reach out to us to try to make some of these questions answerable. There is a ton of anecdotal information that these are working and have high success rates, and I have no hard data. Again, anecdotally, wildlife use these even short stubby branches a lot, and that even in live trees, we often see birds perched on the dead parts of the live trees. So we don't necessarily need, we maybe shouldn't be removing all of those dead branches in areas where it's sort of safe to do so. Those dead branches aren't always going to break off immediately, and we could be a little more thoughtful about removing dead branches from trees. Again, because it's all anecdotal, I would say that one of the reasons we see more birds perched on dead branches on trees is because it's easier to see them, because there isn't foliage. Maybe there's 12 birds perched in that tree. You can only see the one on the dead branch because there's no foliage there. I'm open to that idea. That's why we have science to try to rule out things like that, but there just isn't a lot of science in this field. Doing the best we can. But I agree with your observation 100%. We can see it right here. And I'll just point out that here's my email address. If anyone ever, just reach out to me. I've also got some email addresses with tree care for birds on it that go to me as well. But anyways, I'd love to hear from you all, keep this conversation going, and thanks for joining me today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan.